Good morning. My name is Jamie Waterfield, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for the first in a series of panel discussions brought to you by Apex Digital Solutions. Over the next few weeks, we will be speaking with experts across managed security solutions, incident response and recovery, legal, and insurance on advice before, during, and after a security breach. Our host for today's panel discussion is Apex Digital Solutions founder and CEO, Jason Lamberis. We wish to welcome and thank our panelists joining us today, who each bring a significant amount of experience in their respective fields of work. Sean Blankhorn, Senior Security Advisor to Apex Digital Solutions. Stephen Legg, Co-founder and CEO of Antigen Security. Chris Martella, shareholder with Kemp Klein Law Firm, and Brian Pilarski, commercial insurance agent with Brown & Brown Detroit. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to you, Jason.
Thank you, Jamie, and welcome everyone. I want to just thank in advance our panelists for joining us today, not only for this part, but our subsequent series that we'll be having over the course of the next few weeks, as Jamie has mentioned. So I want to start out, right? It's no secret that everything around us has been changing at a blistering pace. And while that's no surprise, I wanted to start out by sharing a few recent facts and figures from the last year that you may not have been aware of. So a few things, right? Based on research from Microsoft, Verizon, CrowdStrike, IBM, a few things that I wanted to share. First is that organized crime in this past year was behind 55% of breaches. And 70% of those breaches were perpetrated by external actors. 30 of them, which this may be surprising, involved people within those organizations. And 31% of the breaches involved employee error, often from misdelivery of information or misconfiguration of security protocols and systems. 80% of those incidents were financially motivated, which is why no surprise that ransomware now accounts for 27% of any of the malware incidents. And while you may think that this only happens to the big guys, 28% of those breaches involve small business victims. The impact of the pandemic and the need for remote work have further complicated security preparedness and incident response, and has highly contributed to roughly 125% increase in electronic crime in the past year alone. So, our stance today is it's not a matter of if, it's really a matter of when and to what degree you will experience a breach, and are you prepared? So let's get into it. I want to start out with our panelists and tee up a first question for Chris Martella. Chris, what are the few key things that people in organizations should be doing in preparation for a breach?
Well, I'm going to say there are two major things, and I'm sure other people on this will back this up or even argue with it. But one is having a cyber hygiene policy, having policies and procedures in place for your employees, for your staff, for even your outside vendors. So, you know, it's more than just having the policies internally, but also having a stance externally with your contract vendors. The lawyer in me says, are you addressing it in your contracts? Is it being discussed in your contracts? That is number one. Number two is, what kind of protection do you have? There's always the hardware stuff, there's the IT side, but do you have, and Brian I'm sure is going to jump on this, what's your cyber liability insurance look like? Do you have it, one, and have you reviewed it? Do you have an agent that understands it? Have you talked about it with your internal people, your CIO, your outside vendors like Apex? You know, the question becomes, have you audited it? Have you looked at it? So those are the two, I'm going to stick with those are the two real basics, and I'm going to let others kind of chime in because I know we have limited time. So Jason, I will punt it back to you. Kept it short and sweet.
So I'm gonna jump over to Stephen here. Stephen, what are, again, from your perspective and all the things that you've seen in helping clients prepare with incident response planning, what are the key things that they should really be thinking about today?
Well, it's a great question, Jason, and really the The core of it starts with understanding your incident response plan. What is your plan? Who's involved? What do they need to be doing? You also want to make sure, to Chris's point, that your preferred IR team is a part of your cyber liability policy. If they're not already working with that insurer, you need to work with them to get written in, as well as knowing what you can and cannot detect from a technical perspective. These things are all kind of core to being prepared and being able to overcome things that do come at your business.
Good. Keying off of one of the things that Chris had mentioned, Brian, he said good cyber liability insurance. Can you expand upon that a little bit for us? What does good really look like and feel like?
It's a great question, and it is a subjective term, good, but there really are two major components to a cyber liability, cyber insurance policy, and the first one is liability, which means you're responsible, and that costs money. If you're responsible, there's usually some type of financial tie to that. So the first thing they would want to look at on a cyber insurance policy is do they have cyber liability? So there are certain laws and requirements to keep non-public information confidential. And if there is a breach, if there is a possibility that those records are now compromised, organizations owe a duty to those individuals and businesses that could have had their non-public information shared. So there are costs to monitor that we're responsible for. There could be some identity theft issues they need to resolve financially. There could be other fines and penalties from various government agencies and private organizations about failure to keep that data safe. So a cyber liability policy covers that third-party expense. The second component would be on a cyber insurance policy is that first-party expense. When you talked earlier about the crime, the ransomware events that are happening, that costs individual businesses money themselves. They may be caught in a situation where they're being extorted for a certain amount of money for the data to be released back to them. We see various issues with phishing campaigns where money is accidentally transferred. We see invoice manipulation where customers think they're paying a client of ours or a client of yours, and they're really paying a bad actor or criminal. And all that's covered under the first party section of a cyber insurance policy. So a good cyber insurance policy will cover the responsibility of others that you may be liable for, and also protect the organization from crime, loss of money, theft of money, electronic vandalism of a variety of systems that may cost a lot of time and money to repair.
Good. I'm going to stick it with you for a second here, Brian. You had mentioned in a conversation that we were having a few weeks back, right? Is a cyber liability policy the only thing you need, or are there other policies that should be looked at and considered in the grand scheme of things?
Great question. And my comment earlier about crime and it relates to first party insurance and having money for that is you really need a crime policy to zipper up, like together with your cyber liability policy, because there's a lot of iterations of this type of events that could lead to a financial loss. I mean, money being stolen or not received by an organization that should be because of the intervention of electronic means. You may not be covered on a cyber policy. You may need crime insurance to kind of pick up where that gray gap may be. So for instance, as an example, I've had a few clients of mine that have had large customers, very large global organizations. Somebody infiltrated their systems and was monitoring email activity and captured some invoices. So they made they contacted the large organization, said, hey, we changed our bank account. And subsequently, over $1 million was paid to a bad actor, not to our clients. And because that breach didn't happen at our client level, the cyber insurance policy doesn't respond to that. It's actually crime of money that was owed to them. Our organization our client there didn't lose money. They just weren't paid money as a result of electronic crime. So a crime insurance policy steps in and picks up where that gap doesn't. The last kind of dovetail to a true cyber liability and financial protection policy would be to make sure that you have a property policy that includes voluntary party. So we also see a lot of fake orders being submitted to the manufacturer and distributors where there might be a new stock or a new order that they might have not vetted for some reason. They hadn't gone through credit checks, and they ship it to a bad actor, and they find out that it was a fraudulent event, and that they're out $70,000 of inventory. But because a company voluntarily gave that away, they were tricked or duped of giving that. Insurance doesn't respond to that. They only respond to accidents, things that you couldn't foresee. So in order to kind of, encapsulate that and get coverage for an organization, is you need voluntary parting of property. If you're tricked, duped, or schemed to doing so, insurance will cover you there.
Good, appreciate that. So I'll kind of tee this up. Whoever would like to take it between Sean and Steve and Chris, right? And I want to maybe not play devil's advocate a little bit, right? But I think that there's a belief out there that, hey, if I get the right insurance policies, then I'm covered, right? I've shifted my responsibility, so to speak, right? And we know that's not really the case. So in any order, right? Chime in. Chris, Sean, Steven, what are the key things that people need to understand at the end of the day they are still responsible for?
Well, I can answer. I mean, I will say to Brian's point, it's about layering. It's very important to understand the layering. You called it zippering. I've talked to clients about layering. No one policy fits all. Understanding your business and actually sitting down with decision makers and your insurance provider and talking about your business. What happens, and I've seen it from the legal side, because usually this is what happens. There is a breach. Either you ship products to the wrong person, it was an invoice issue, there's been some cyber event. And after you figure it out inside your company, you call one of two people. You either call your insurance agent or your lawyer. And at that point, when I'm getting the phone call, I then have to go through their policy and go, well, is there coverage? And people say, well, I have cyber liability. Well, you do. You paid for something, but what does it cover? They didn't go through this kind of the cyber hygiene and review of what their policy actually covers. There is no one size fits all. There is no one policy you buy and it covers what your losses are. So I literally tell people the most important thing to do with a cyber liability policy is sit down with your insurance agent and go through the coverage. Insurance agents today, this is not 10 years ago. Insurance agents today that are selling cyber policies understand what's in the marketplace. And there's a lot more than there ever was before. And Brian, as you astutely pointed out, there's loss for bad invoicing that might be covered under your crime rather than your general liability or your cyber policy. But unless you've had that discussion and unless you've actually reviewed it before a breach and actually gone through kind of the cyber hygiene and checking, you have no idea. Just Steve and Sean and Jason, you'll talk about pen testing and all the rest of it. This is the equivalent of penetration testing for your insurance policy. It's actually, trying it on, making sure it fits, making sure it's what you need, and understanding that you might have to tailor it a little bit. You might have to buy a different policy here, up there, or down there, and being aware of what's in it and how your business changes. And changes, you have to talk to your insurance provider. Because when a breach happens, it's too late. You can't change your policy when it happens. So the best is to actually pen test your policy, and actually walk through it with your insurance person. So that's one of my big picture 30,000-foot view. Sean, I'll let you and Steven, kind of also chime in.
What I'll add on my side is, what you have to think about is the fact that at the end of the day, the insurance company, while a partner to yourself, that they will always work to limit exposure as well, right? So you have to really understand the clauses. Chris, to your point, penetration test. Understand what it does cover and what it does not cover, and understand there will always be costs associated with a breach that are outside the coverage of an insurance policy. You can't simply mitigate all the risk with an insurance policy. You have to think about things like reputational damage, right? So if that has a negative impact on partnerships, those can have lasting impacts, legacy type of impacts with your partnerships that you might have with a large supplier. If you're an automotive supplier, there may be a destruction of trust that way. So you have to think about all of those impacts that might come across from a business perspective. And Stephen, I'll let you jump in too.
Yeah, no, what I was going to add to that was, and this all kind of feeds into the point I was going to make. So thanks for sharing that. Validated. We do penetration tests to understand and validate that the measures we put in place are doing what they're meant to do, and fix it when they're not. Tabletop exercises, similarly, before an incident occurs, allow you to walk through that incident and those different scenarios to understand, well, what would happen if we got ransomware, if our backups were not available, if X, Y, and Z happen, what do we do? Are we really having this conversation as a business and understanding the impacts to our third-party relationships, to our clients, to our vendors, to our brand? What is it really going to look like? And bringing your lawyer to the table, whether that's a breach coach or your general counsel, bringing your insurance folks to the table, bringing your technical teams to the table, as well as your executive team, is really important and a kind of a critical part of really thinking that through and making sure that you have validated that your ducks are in a row right before it happens. Because as Chris mentioned, you can't rewrite the policy. You can't have the plan in place the day it happens. Everyone has to be prepared before that.
Yeah, that's a great point. The analogy I'll make that a lot of people do is that you have to buy auto insurance, but you still lock your car. You don't leave valuable things in it. There's all these things that are ingrained in you. Organizations should be doing the equivalent for cybersecurity and confidential data. And it's just a newer topic for them to get their hands around. But they should be doing all the additional measures in addition to just buying insurance or just, think they have a locked firewall or pen test. There's a lot more to continuity planning, to understanding the various components of how technology and data plays in their business and the function of it.
Yeah, and that's business continuity planning, disaster recovery planning, all of those things feed into incident response planning, because if you're structuring it correctly, your incident response plan should be the trigger for all of those things, right? That's how the conversation starts. You go in, you qualify what's happening, you understand the scope and damage and what the potential impact is. And then you use your contingencies, you pick up your tools that you've prepared and your playbooks, and you go run those, right? And how your cyber liability insurance is going to play into that. When you need to engage your outside counsel to protect records or make sure that you're managing your liability in situations that are very sensitive. That when and how to do PR and client outreach, and when to go and cover bases with folks that might have been impacted from a privacy perspective. There's lots of things to think about and impacts to the business. And really that's, I guess if I had to point out a key takeaway for all of that, it's we need to stop thinking about cyber issues as though they aren't crime. Cyber crime is crime, it's fraud. And fundamentally, that's what you're protecting your business from, is crime and fraud.
So I want to play off of that concept a little bit too, right? I think there's sometimes a preconceived notion as to what a breach really is, or what defines the term breach, right? Cybercrime being that part. But as I mentioned in the beginning, sometimes it's just an accident, right? Somebody misdelivers information, things happen. So, Sean, I'm going to go to you on this, right? Can you maybe expand upon that and really share by definition, right, in the eyes of governing bodies, so to speak, out there, and sometimes reporting requirements, what defines what a breach is in some scenarios? And share. I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of I would say kind of universally amongst organizations there's ambiguity in terms of what defines a breach, right? And I think there's kind of the legal definition and then what we see within the industry, right? To me there's a fairly, and Chris can agree or disagree, I guess, from a legal perspective. There's a legal definition of a breach, meaning typically that's tied to the loss of information that is private information of some sort, right? PHI, private health information, or something of that nature, where there's specific laws and regulations that have been written to protect that information. You'll see within the industry a lot of people discuss breaches more generally, right? The fact that any circumvention of technical controls or things, technology you put in place could be conceived as a breach. Those are really, by legal definition, more security events, right? There are things that are going to happen day to day. And breach is typically, from a legal perspective, really tied down to breach of information that might be tied to legal language or regulatory language. But at the end of the day, it doesn't always matter, right? The point is, I guess, organizations have to understand what a security event means, right? If they put technical constraints or technical controls in place to protect the organization, and those are circumvented, those are events that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, and they will happen, on a day-to-day basis. And you mentioned, the breach is inevitable, and that's a critical component to the mentality that an organization must adapt. But really, it comes down to what happens during that breach, and does it get to the point where protected information has been exposed? And in those cases, then we have to be concerned about what privacy laws or what breach notification laws must be adhered to in those types of situations.
Good. Chris, any additional thoughts to share?
Well, Sean, I will not disagree with you at all. A matter of fact, in most of the legal definitions, any unauthorized use, access, or manipulation of company assets. And again, there's two worlds. It's kind of like a choose your own adventure or a Venn diagram. You have a breach, a security incident occurred, and then we have to say, well, what did that look like? Was PII or PHI or some government or state regulated information taken or exposed? That's what happens with that as we go down path A, versus an invoice or a fraudulent invoice or a fraudulent manipulated order or a ransomware attack. That is a whole nother. So, again, the responses vary and your legal obligations vary. If somebody presents a fraudulent invoice to you, okay, and you pay it, you call the police, you report that way, and then that's working with your insurance company and your private data security people to rectify that. Versus if somebody breaks into your PII or gets a hold of, payment information that is personally identifiable information, that has a whole nother, although the team that you're working with may be exactly the same people, have other requirements. You have to report, you have to provide credit monitoring services, you have to report to so many people. That's a whole different set of rules and regulations. Your legal obligation changes. You have third-party legal obligations when PII is involved, or you have GDPR issues with the European government, versus, if your information gets stolen and a fraudulent invoice is put out, in most cases, you don't have to report that to anybody. You should, government agencies, etc., but you don't have an obligation. So that is really what changes. And the type of data breach you have, and having that team in place, having your an incident response team in place that knows that things are going to be different. Again, whether it's your insurance policy or your breach notification or your incident response, it varies based on the type of information that's taken. And Jason, you said it very well. So many of these breaches occur because of an internal issue. Somebody clicks on a bad email or they spoof it or whatnot. That happens. And how you respond is very important. And I say this to all, and this is going to piggyback a little bit outside the question, but important because this is going to come up. How much is enough? Like, how much coverage do I need? How much should I be paying Jason and Apex and Antigen to oversee my network? Well, the law has a reasonableness standard to it. What Microsoft, what Facebook, what Google can spend on cybersecurity eclipses what everybody I know, companies can spend in 30 years on cybersecurity. I mean, what Microsoft spends a day is more than most mid-size and small businesses will spend in a lifetime in cybersecurity. And that's reasonable for Microsoft. That may not be reasonable for your small tier 3 supplier. And that's okay. If somebody says, well, you're not spending $100,000 a year in cybersecurity. Well, we don't even profit $100,000 a year. why would we spend that? So there is a reasonability standard, and that is why talking to your lawyer, talking to your insurance people, having certain coverage is important, and understanding what your needs are and what your exposure and risk and your threat vectors look like. Because the lawyer will tell you, listen, you can't bankrupt yourself paying for cyber liability insurance. But you might say, I got to spend more money on cyber than I do on general business liability because I'm a healthcare provider and I have mountains of personally identifiable information and PHI. Or I'm a tier 3 supplier and I'm providing widget a light bulb mount to the manufacturer, to the vendor. What's my cyber breach? A bad invoice? I bill out $100,000 in parts a year. So your cyber liability is different. And therefore the type of insurance you need and the type of response team you have in place can vary. So don't freak out when somebody says, do you have enough? Because it's a relative term. And that's where it's talking to insurance, it's talking to your key holding and people, your CFO, your CEO, and to your lawyer, and having that discussion. So sorry, I know I went a little off trace, but
no, it's good. So you kind of teed me up to kind of close us out for this thought anyway. And before we move on to the next one, Sean, I'm going to go to you. So playing a little off of what Chris had shared, right? Knowing that there's a lot to do out there, there's limited budget and time, right? For our audience, if there's one thing they should go take a look at or check on or go to today or tomorrow, right? What is that in your mind?
Yeah, I'm going to say for me, it's really two things, right? And I know you said one, but I'm going to give you two. For me, it comes back to basics, right? At the end of the day, everything that we talked about kind of points to the fact that you need to understand what your critical assets and what your critical systems are within your company. And you need to understand what sensitive information you have, whether that's tied to regulatory compliance requirements or sensitive information based on partnerships to the company. But you need to understand what systems you have that are critical and where that sensitive information exists within your environment, how it interacts. Because if and when there's a breach, we can, at a minimum, if we can understand how that data may or may not have been impacted, that will dictate some of our next steps if we didn't do anything else, right? Hopefully we're doing all the other steps that everyone's talked about, but fundamentally we have to understand those two things.
Great. Thank you. All right, so keeping along the same vein of same topic of preparedness, right? Let's start out with Stephen. What are the few key mistakes, right, in preparedness? Few key mistakes or assumptions that you see people making about what preparedness really means, or what a breach really involves.
So, I mean, there's lots of ways we can come at this, but I think the couple that I'll talk about really come down to having really effective conversations about what the realities of your security measures and response measures are. This goes back to a point I made earlier about what you can detect. Something like 1 in 5 small and medium businesses every year will experience a breach. That's just a reality. So for those businesses, understanding to Chris and Sean, both of your points about like what minimum viable security looks like. Do you have the right things in place? Do you have the right relationships? Are you putting all your eggs in a basket that is not well protected? Are you thinking about that? Have you talked about ransomware? Have you talked about some of these very common scenarios that are happening to businesses all the time? And so what's not happening a lot of times is at the executive level or at the leadership level within organizations, they're frankly just not talking about this. They're thinking, oh, this is a problem for nerds and not for business owners. Our technical guys will care, but we don't care. We're fine. We have antivirus. We're good. Right? So this mentality and just generally the act of dismissing it is one of the critical flaws I would say most leadership teams make, especially in the small and medium business realm of the market.
So I'm gonna stay there for a minute, Stephen. Right, from your perspective, we'll call it the technical folks, right? The nerds, which we all know and love. If they're having difficulty getting the attention, so to speak, or getting their executives to take this seriously, what have you seen be successful, right, in helping to kind of break that ground?
It goes back to the thread really that's been common this whole conversation that we're having here, and that is what you're talking about isn't a vulnerability. It's not a system. It's not bits and bytes. We're talking about crime. We're talking about fraud. We're talking about things that really will impact the business. And unless you start as a technical person talking about risk and talk to the business about risk and have real conversations about quantifying risk, you will not be successful at having those conversations with executive leaders that are not open to it, because you're not talking their language, right?
Fair, very fair. Brian, key mistakes or assumptions you see people making about preparedness, right, or what a breach really involves?
Well, I think Steve hit it well, and also Sean. I think that one of the biggest mistakes I see is people just dismiss that they're vulnerable. They just think it won't happen to them. I think, Jason, you opened with that thought that I don't have anything valuable. I don't have anything that they're not going to come after me. I'm not a target. I don't have it. So every day I have that objection from a business owner. To Steve's point, it's just not in their language. I don't think they understand, the true big picture of what's happening and what will and could happen to them. So it's often a discussion is hard for me to have with them, because I don't have the data that you have to say, listen, here's the statistics, here's what's going to happen, because they just don't think it's going to happen to them. So that's the biggest mistake I see in the type of discussion strategically, just as Steve was saying, I see every single day. And they've sometimes pitted me with their IT professional face to face. And it becomes a very personal thing versus a global organizational type of discussion. And the second piece, Chris had mentioned it earlier, it's kind of been a theme interlaced throughout this. Jason, you asked a few questions on it, is what type of insurance is in place if something happens? And if you do have insurance, do you know the partners? Do you have the phone number? To draw back to a car insurance analogy, if you get in an accident, you have something in your glove box. A lot of times when people are hit with some type of event, they don't know who or what to call or how. So organizationally, that back to the continuity plan, having that situational awareness of what to do if something goes wrong is the second biggest mistake I see organizations make.
Well, Brian, I know you'd spoken a little bit about earlier in the conversation about really the layering of these policies, right? And that the false assumption that people sometimes make is that if they have business interruption policy, right, or business continuity policy, that in maybe not a cyber crime policy, but if there's impact to the business, they're still covered. You'd share with me in most, if not all cases, that's not true, right? If the cause was cyber crime, that policy, even though you may have it for business interruption, will not cover the loss of revenue or the impact of the organization. Or the flip side of that, if you don't have business interruption and you do have your cyber crime, that cyber crime isn't going to cover that business interruption. So
exactly right. The vulnerability the organizations have as it becomes more automated and connected, and these smart Internet of Things. I mean, a lot of manufacturing is completely automated. And if there's a breach event there and cease that, the cyber policy can cover business interruption, but it's got to be structured the right way. A lot do not. And there is a difference between cyber insurance and cyber liability insurance, and that's the key to understanding. And the last point I'll make in trying to make these decisions, and Chris had made a point, you can't go bankrupt buying insurance. The key to risk management and risk transfer is you retain the risks you can afford to retain, and transfer the ones you cannot afford to retain. So look at an auto insurance policy. You can, if you wrecked a car, the physical damage, you don't have to replace it, or you can lease it. A company could get along without that. But if there's a major breach event and they're looking at millions of liability, of responsibility, millions of dollars, and they could have transferred that for a couple $1,000. They should do that. So we often work with our clients, to Chris's point, and I'll end here, is how can you, make this cost neutral? Can you tinker with some things that you can retain? Just increase the deductible and not buy something that we know has a very low probability and not a big dollar amount, big severity. And can we transfer some of that spend to a cyber liability policy to protect the continuity of the organization going forward?
Very good. Chris, false assumptions, critical mistakes you from your perspective see people making out there?
The number one false assumption and critical mistake is you think you have more coverage and you're more secure than you actually are, because no one has had that discussion with the stakeholders, with insurance, with your breach team. I give a very good example, and here's the story goes like this. I had a client come to me and asked me to review his cyber liability insurance for his business. He gave me 3 different policies. I broke down the 3 different policies based on because a longstanding client, based on my understanding of the business. Okay. And I said, to Brian's point, you don't need very much breach notification because you don't have any PII. Okay. So don't waste your money on that. Put it towards fraudulent invoices and business interruption. Okay. And the policies were anywhere between $7,000 and $14,000. Okay. And the CEO said to me, Chris, you know what? I just don't see the need. I've been operating my company without it for all these years. I don't need it. Okay. On a Sunday, about 5 months later, I get a frantic phone call from the CEO who says to me, Chris, my wife's credit card information has been stolen and they shut off her credit cards and she's on vacation in Italy and she can't buy fill in the blank stuff. And I said, well, okay. He goes, so about that cyber liability policy you were telling me about, I think we should get it. I said, oh, good. That's wonderful. Thank you. I think it's a good idea. And why I tell the story is until it hit home to the stakeholders that it could happen. And now that's a very personal story, but sometimes they don't see it. And to Steve, your question, and even to Jason, how do you get the stakeholders and how do you get the CEO sometimes to actually speak and understand? Well, have them call their lawyer. Please call me. I'm happy to talk to the CEO and explain to them what their risks and liabilities are. Okay. And there is a disconnect. I tell my clients 3 things. Identify your assets and your threat vectors. Number 1, work with your insurance providers and your IT people about those, get those answers. 2, communicate that to the stakeholders. And if you need help, if you need a translator, if you need somebody who can speak, no offense to the people on this call, who can speak geek and then also speak to business people, because it's 2 different languages. Okay. Jason, you said it. Everyone said it. Oh, the geeks, we love them, but sometimes they're the people that sit in the basement and they're doing their thing. They're tertiary. We don't care. When you can promote to the business owner, hey, this is how it affects you and your bottom line. That's a big saving grace. That's the communication piece. And last but not least, in small and medium-sized businesses, identify a person or persons. 1 or 2. Do not try to do this by committee, because what I've seen happen is the following. Oh, I thought Jason was handling that. Oh, I thought Sean, weren't you on that committee? Sean, you were on that. Steve, you're on that committee, right? Who is handling that? In a breach, in an incident, the last thing you're going to want to do is figure out who the heck internally is supposed to be addressing this. Because time, as everyone on this Zoom, everyone on this panel will know, is the most important thing. The more time you spend, it costs more money, the threats get worse, the dollar amounts get higher, the ability to repair gets further off into the future. So have people, identified people that are there that you can call, whether it's internal or external. Who does what? And just like a fire drill, if you have the person in your building that makes sure people get out the door into the right stairwell, or the other person that checks all the offices to make them out, that's a physical thing, but it can very much translate to the cybersecurity environment. And most insurance companies will help you walk through that, will help you will actually coach you. They actually bring in a cyber coach, whether it's through insurance, private, through your own people. Those are the things. So again, to the very part of the initial part of Jason's question is, what do people think? They think they have more coverage or they're more protected than they are. It's not a matter of if it's going to happen. It's a matter of when.
Right.
You will experience some sort of cyber incident, good or bad, in the life of your business. The question is, how much is it going to cost you? And how long is it going to take to fix? There.
Sean,
Myself up.
I'm going to go to you. So for critical mistakes or assumptions in the vein of preparedness.
Yeah, I'm gonna echo, essentially much of what has been said, but just, and from my perspective, speak to the fact that it starts with a mentality within the organization, right? It starts with leadership accepting that security is a business problem, not a technical problem, not a technology problem, right? It doesn't exist in IT. It's not an IT department issue. Security is a business issue, and they have to accept that. It has to be a mentality. Everything else flows from that, right? Getting the right budgets, doing the right things, all flow from that mentality, that acceptance from a leadership perspective. Without that, we get into those nightmare scenarios that you have, right? If we have leadership that simply don't see that they have risk, then we'll go down those dark paths that we don't want to go down, right? And taking a simple example, Jason used the stat near the top that 27% of incidents now are ransomware, right? And I think Brian, you had mentioned that organizations, a lot of them think, hey, we're not going to have risk, or we have nothing of value, right, for anyone. Well, ransomware turned that on its head, right? It went from being able to steal intellectual property to I don't need to care what information you might have that's valuable or not valuable. It's valuable to you in the operations of your business. If I can restrict you from accessing your own data, I now have a critical hold on your organization, right? And now that information is valuable to you. It may not be valuable to anyone else, but it's valuable to you. And that's why so many people pay ransoms today, right? So, but that all flows again from just the business accepting that this is a business problem, not a technology problem, and that mentality must flow down from there. And then all of these other great things, planning, insurance, understanding all the components can be built from there.
Thank you, Sean.
I wanted to add one thing to what you said, Sean, just because I love what you just shared. And this is a conversation I have with a lot of executives, just to add some flavor here. Technology is now business, right? Technology is a part of how we do business. It is integrated in everything that we do. So really, when you think about technology, good technical practices are secure technical practices, right? And secure technical practices by proxy or by relationship really are just good business practices. And so that's what you need. That's the conversation you need to have with executives. To your point, Sean, these are good business practices, and this is just thinking it through, right?
And I'll add one last point to that, to Sean and Steve. I mean, I don't want to speak for Chris, but Chris and I usually are on the back end. The preventative is usually where all the value is. Good organizations put a lot of emphasis and investment on the prevention. So working with Apex, working with Antigen, that is the best strategy to managing this risk, is the prevention side. And when it blows up, it's too late, and now we're just kind of cleaning up the mess. That's what I do, and that's what Chris does, and we just try to scratch and claw the best we can. And prevention is where everyone's shifting to, that we're working with.
Again, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, the old adage. It's no different in your cybersecurity environment. And Sean and Steve, you are 100% correct. Sean, I couldn't have said it better yourself, nor Steve. Good business practices are, by corollary, good cybersecurity practices. I mean, we're going to touch on it right now, and maybe this will lead you into another question, Jason. But with the distributed workforce model of the pandemic, we have moved. We have moved forward in the use of technology in the workplace by 5 years in the course of a year, if not more. The amount of people using home internet, using the internet to just conduct business. Went from, work from home was, 20%. And I actually know this for a fact. The Economist had an article. Work from home in the United States was about 20% of the workforce prior to the pandemic. Now it is at a minimum 50, and they figure it's going to stay in the 50-50 range for the foreseeable future. There has been a fundamental shift in how we interact with technology, and it's affected everything from lawyers, who are the tortoises of the industry. We don't change. We still use words that are 200 years old. Okay, we don't change. We if anyone doesn't like change, it's attorneys. The fact that we're doing this and we're using technology, and we are in the world of Zoom calls for court hearings and voice over IP phones. I mean, this is now common discussion. Whether it's business, it is me functioning, and now I have to secure you, my associate or my attorney, on the other side of town or the other side of the country. And that
Chris, it is definitely complicating things from some of the stats that I was seeing, including, right, the amount of time it now takes to essentially control a breach, right, or respond to a breach. So I know a lot of great content for us to still get into. I want to be respectful to our attendees and land us pretty much on time here. So I just want to thank all of you gentlemen again for your experience, your knowledge, your expertise. We are going to continue to share some thoughts through a few blogs, and please be sure to join us next week if you haven't registered already for part 2, where we're going to get into what to do or what goes on during a breach itself. So again, that'll be on May 12th at 11 a.m. next Wednesday, same time. And hopefully we address some questions along the way that were submitted previously. Feel free to reach out if there's follow-up questions that anybody may have out there in the audience. So again, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for our attendees, and have a great day.